November 24th, 1950. It was a cold, quiet night in Burlington, Vermont. The streets outside were empty, lit only by the soft glow of street lamps. Inside a small hospital room, a young woman labored in pain, exhausted and anxious. Moments later, a baby boy cried his first breath into the world. His name was Ted Bundy. No one could have imagined, at that moment, the path this small, innocent child would eventually take. A path that would make him one of the most feared names in American criminal history. From the very beginning, Ted seemed normal. He laughed. He played. He formed friendships like other children. Neighbors described him as polite, well-mannered, and sweet. On the outside, he was unremarkable, harmless, friendly, someone you could trust. But appearances can be deceiving. Inside Ted's household, a series of lies and dark truths were quietly shaping him. He was raised believing his grandparents were his parents. The woman he thought was his sister, she was actually his mother. It was a confusing secret, one that would lay the foundation for the inner darkness that would one day consume him. Even as a young child, Ted began noticing the harsh realities of the world around him. His grandfather, a man with a terrible temper, could explode violently for no apparent reason. He yelled, broke things, and sometimes even harmed animals. Little Ted watched, silently, carefully, observing every reaction, every fear, every tiny detail. One night, when Ted was only 3 years old, something happened that would later be seen as an early warning sign. His aunt woke up suddenly and saw Ted standing by her bed. In his small hands, he held the kitchen knife. Around him were more knives, neatly laid out. He was silent, expressionless, watching. No one understood it at the time, but it was the first glimpse of the darkness within him. As he grew older, Ted learned to hide what he felt inside. He became increasingly charming and intelligent. In school, teachers liked him. Girls noticed him. He learned the power of appearance. If you seem harmless, people will trust you. If you appear friendly, people will let down their guard. Yet, inside, he was disconnected, isolated, and fascinated by human behavior. He studied people, how they reacted, how they trusted, how they could be manipulated. He learned to wear a mask of normalcy, blending perfectly into society while his inner world quietly darkened. During his teenage years, Ted discovered the truth about his family. The woman he had always believed to be his sister was actually his mother. The entire foundation of his childhood, the identity he had relied upon, was a lie. The betrayal cut deep. Ted felt powerless, humiliated, and alone. But he did not outwardly show his pain. Instead, he buried it deep inside, where it transformed into anger, and then into a darker, more dangerous obsession. By the time he reached college, Ted had mastered his mask. To the outside world, he was charming, confident, and personable. But inside, a storm was brewing. He met a young woman who captivated him completely. She was everything he thought he wanted, and he fell obsessively in love. But when she left him, that rejection shattered him. It became the catalyst for the monster that would soon emerge. Ted's charm and intelligence masked the growing darkness within him. To everyone around him, he remained the polite, handsome young man who smiled and spoke softly. But deep inside, he was no longer the same. Pain, anger, and humiliation fermented into something far more sinister, something that would soon demand attention, something that would not remain hidden. America had no idea what was coming. Young women walked safely through the streets, unaware that a predator was learning, watching, and preparing. No one suspected that Ted Bundy, the boy they trusted, was quietly becoming one of the most notorious killers the nation would ever see. And so the stage was set. The charm, the smile, the normality, all of it would become a mask for a calculated, methodical, and terrifying mind. By the early 1970s, Ted Bundy had moved to Seattle, Washington, and was a college student. On the surface, he appeared confident, charming, and charismatic. People trusted him instantly. He smiled, dressed neatly, and spoke politely. Everything about him screamed safe and normal. But beneath the charming exterior, the darkness inside Ted had grown stronger. The anger, the humiliation, and the obsession from his teenage years had not faded. Instead, they had festered, waiting for the right opportunity to escape. It began with observation. Ted watched women closely. He studied their routines, how they walked, how they answered questions, how they responded to strangers. He practiced his charm, his friendly demeanor, perfecting it like a mask to hide what lurked underneath. Then came the first moment that changed everything. It was January 4th, 1974. A young woman named Linda and Healy, a college student in Seattle, was alone in her apartment. Ted had noticed her walking near campus before, observing her for weeks, learning her habits. That day, he approached her casually. A polite smile, a friendly greeting. He acted completely harmless. Linda had no reason to suspect anything. She saw a young man who seemed normal, friendly, trustworthy. Ted asked her for help with a supposed problem, a minor favor, something innocent. She agreed, and just like that, she let him into her apartment. Once inside, Ted's control began. He overpowered her swiftly, silently, and efficiently. The friendly mask was gone. The boy who once seemed harmless became something else entirely. Calm, calculated, and cold. Ted kidnapped her. That night, he crossed the line. This first act of violence was methodical. It was deliberate. Ted's intelligence and patience were terrifying. He never acted in a frenzy. Every move was calculated. Every action was designed to avoid detection. For Ted, the thrill was not just in committing the crime, it was in the power he wielded over another human being, the control, the domination, the ability to manipulate perception. After Linda's disappearance, the city was shocked. Neighbors remembered seeing nothing unusual. There were no screams, no witnesses. Ted's charm had allowed him to blend in completely. He became invisible, yet omnipresent, a predator hiding in plain sight. What made Ted Bundy so dangerous was how ordinary he appeared. To friends, classmates, and colleagues, he was polite, intelligent, and personable. No one could imagine that behind the charming smile was a mind capable of extreme violence. This was only the beginning. Once Ted tasted control and the thrill of power, the compulsion grew stronger. He didn't act out of sudden anger or rage. He acted deliberately, almost ritualistically. Every victim, every encounter, became part of a carefully rehearsed pattern. Ted's confidence grew. His crimes became bolder. He no longer confined himself to private apartments. He began to manipulate public spaces, luring women in ways that seemed completely innocent. He would pretend to be injured, asking for help. He would pose as an authority figure. Anything to gain trust. Anything to isolate his victim. By the time the first few disappearances were reported, law enforcement had no leads, no witnesses, no descriptions beyond the fact that young women were vanishing. The city began to panic, but Ted continued undetected. Each success reinforced his belief in his cleverness. Each victim made him bolder. Each time he returned to his normal life, smiling, charming, blending in, he proved to himself how perfect the mask was. Ted Bundy's first victim was not just a tragic loss. She was the opening act of a horrifying series of events. The lesson for Ted was clear. With patience, planning, and charm, he could commit acts of extreme violence and remain free. And so, a terrifying pattern began to emerge. A young, charming man, appearing harmless and trustworthy, would systematically stalk, lure, and murder his victims. The very qualities that made him socially appealing, the smile, the confidence, the friendliness, became weapons in his deadly arsenal. By the end of 1974, Seattle and the surrounding areas were on edge. Women were cautious. Families were terrified. And Ted Bundy, seemingly just a normal college student, had fully embraced his dual life. Outside, charming, polite, intelligent. Inside, calculating, predatory, remorseless. The nightmare had only just begun. Next, Part 3 will cover Ted Bundy's growing spree, his tactics and patterns, and how he began to escalate across states, leaving law enforcement struggling to catch him. Say Part 3, if you want me to continue. By the middle of the 1970s, Ted Bundy's killing spree had begun to spread beyond Seattle. He had tasted the thrill of control, and now he hungered for more. His intelligence, charm, and ability to blend in made him nearly invisible to everyone around him. To the public, he was still the polite, handsome young man who smiled at strangers. But underneath, a predator was methodically planning his next move. Ted's methods evolved. He learned how to be patient. He learned how to wait for the perfect opportunity. He discovered that the most effective weapon was not brute force alone, it was deception. Pretend to be injured. Pretend to be a student. Pretend to need help. Pretend to be harmless. Women who saw him had no reason to fear him. And that trust, that momentary comfort, became the key to his deadly plan. One of Ted's signature tactics involved feigning injury or disability. Sometimes he wore a cast. Sometimes he used crutches. Other times he pretended to have something wrong with his arm or leg. Then, when he approached a young woman on campus or walking alone, he would ask for help, carrying books, moving furniture, giving directions. This tactic was terrifyingly simple in its brilliance. It relied on human instinct, the desire to help those in need. The very qualities that make us compassionate and kind were exploited by Ted Bundy to lure his victims. By 1975, disappearances were reported across multiple campuses in Washington, Oregon, and Utah. Each time, Ted adjusted his strategy, learning from mistakes and staying one step ahead of law enforcement. He became increasingly bold. He no longer confined his attacks to isolated apartments. Public spaces became hunting grounds. Parks, streets, parking lots, anywhere a woman might feel safe, became potential traps. But to the outside world, Ted remained the perfect student. He studied law at the University of Utah. He volunteered. He dated women. He even participated in political campaigns, helping to raise funds and giving speeches. Everywhere he went, people trusted him completely. The chilling thing about Ted Bundy was his duality. On one side, he was charming, witty, even helpful. On the other, he was calculating, cruel, and utterly remorseless. He learned how to compartmentalize, how to switch between the friendly young man and the cold, predatory killer with terrifying efficiency. Victims were disappearing at an alarming rate. Newspapers began to take notice. Parents warned their daughters. Communities grew uneasy. But Ted was always just out of reach. He knew how to cover his tracks, how to choose locations, and how to select victims carefully. He rarely attacked indiscriminately. His killings followed a pattern, a ritual that gave him a sense of control and satisfaction. One of the earliest victims, and the one who marked the true escalation, was Brenda Ball, a young woman in Utah. Ted observed her, approached her under the guise of friendliness, and lured her away. The abduction was clean, methodical, and precise. No witnesses. No struggle that anyone else could see. He had perfected his strategy. Strike silently, leave no trace, and return to his normal life as if nothing had happened. Each successful abduction reinforced his belief in his own cleverness. Each time he returned to his normal life, smiling and polite, he proved to himself how perfect his mask was. He had learned something terrifyingly simple. If you appear harmless, you can get away with almost anything. Ted's spree continued across state lines. Washington, Oregon, Utah, each disappearance heightened the tension. Law enforcement began to notice similarities between the cases, but connecting them to a single suspect was nearly impossible. Ted was meticulous. He left no fingerprints. He left no witnesses, and he always blended into the crowd, the charming young man no one would ever suspect. By now, Ted Bundy was no longer just a college student or a charming young man. He had become a master manipulator, a methodical predator, and a nightmare stalking the American Northwest. Each victim taught him something new. Each abduction honed his skills, and each escape without consequence fueled the darkness within him. And yet, despite the escalating killings, Ted continued to interact with friends, classmates, and even authorities without suspicion. He dated women, attended classes, and continued volunteering. He had learned to hide the monster so effectively that the world never saw it coming. The pattern was clear: charm, lure, isolate, control, and strike. But the reach was expanding. Ted was no longer content with one or two victims. His obsession with control and power was growing, and with it, his killing spree became bolder, more dangerous, and more terrifying. The escalation was complete. The killer was no longer learning, he was hunting. Ted Bundy was evolving into a predator whose intelligence, patience, and charm made him one of the most dangerous serial killers in history. And yet, to the outside world, he remained invisible, smiling, and entirely trustworthy. By 1976, Ted Bundy's reign of terror had expanded far beyond Seattle. He had mastered the art of appearing ordinary, charming, and completely trustworthy, but now his crimes were crossing state lines, making him even harder to catch. Washington, Oregon, and Utah were no longer enough. He began targeting women in Colorado, Idaho, and Utah, leaving law enforcement scrambling for answers. Ted's methods had evolved into a terrifying pattern. He carefully studied his victims. College-aged women walking alone, working late, or living in isolated apartments, these were his targets. But he was no longer just attacking impulsively, he was planning meticulously. Every detail mattered. Every opportunity was calculated. One of his signature methods during this period was deception. He would feign injury, a cast on his arm, a crutch, or some other believable ailment. Then he would approach a young woman, asking for help. "Can you carry these books?" he might say. Or, "I'm moving this furniture. Could you give me a hand?" To anyone observing, he was perfectly harmless, helpful, even kind. But the moment the woman let down her guard, Ted's true self emerged, cold, calculated, and deadly. In Utah, his crimes escalated dramatically. He began breaking into apartments late at night. He moved silently, taking care to avoid detection. He left almost no evidence behind. Victims vanished without a trace, and the local communities began to panic. Families warned their daughters to stay indoors. Colleges issued safety alerts. Yet Ted remained a student, a volunteer, and a seemingly ordinary young man. He dated women. He charmed classmates and professors alike. No one could imagine the monster hiding behind that boyish smile. By now, law enforcement was beginning to see a pattern. Multiple disappearances of young women across state lines had similarities. Age, appearance, the method of approach. But connecting the dots to a single suspect was almost impossible. Ted Bundy had become a ghost, a master of disguise and deception. He knew how to vanish into the crowd. He could blend in anywhere, on campus, in a city street, or in a small town. And when the first few reports were filed, the authorities treated them as separate incidents, not realizing they were dealing with a single, highly intelligent predator. One chilling aspect of Ted's crimes during this period was his ability to manipulate perception. He often interacted with witnesses before and after attacks, maintaining the illusion of normalcy. He would smile. He would speak politely. He would appear trustworthy. And by doing so, he reinforced his mask, ensuring suspicion never fell on him. Ted's confidence was growing. Each abduction and murder reinforced his belief in his invincibility. He wasn't reckless, he was strategic. He learned from mistakes and refined his tactics with each crime. Every successful escape strengthened the monster inside him. By 1977, Ted Bundy's spree had reached a terrifying new level. He was no longer confined to one state, one campus, or one city. He had become a nomadic predator, traveling across the West, carefully choosing locations and victims. He targeted sororities, college campuses, public parks, and streets. Each attack was meticulously planned. He took steps to isolate his victims, exploit their trust, and maintain complete control. His methods were as calculated as they were terrifying. To the outside world, he was still the same friendly, charming, intelligent man. A student, a volunteer, a boyfriend, a friend, a man you could trust. But behind that perfect mask was a predator evolving with each crime. His understanding of human behavior, combined with his patience and cunning, made him virtually untouchable. The FBI and local police were beginning to realize they were hunting a serial killer. But the challenge was monumental. Ted Bundy had crossed multiple jurisdictions, leaving investigators frustrated and chasing shadows. By the end of 1977, Ted Bundy was no longer just a killer. He was a master manipulator, a man capable of hiding in plain sight while leaving destruction in his wake. He had learned one critical lesson. If you appear harmless, you can commit unspeakable acts and remain free. And with that lesson, Ted Bundy's spree was entering its most dangerous phase yet. By the late 1970s, Ted Bundy had become increasingly bold and reckless. His crimes had spread across multiple states: Washington, Oregon, Utah, Colorado, Idaho. But it was in Florida that his spree would reach a terrifying crescendo. Ted had a pattern: charm, deception, and meticulous planning. Yet by this point his ego was growing. He believed he was untouchable. Law enforcement had begun piecing together the connection between the disappearances, but they had no idea of the full scope of his crimes. In Florida, Bundy focused on college campuses and sorority houses. His approach was chillingly simple: gain trust, isolate the victim, and strike. He would often pretend to be injured, asking for help carrying books or packages, or posing as someone in authority. His charisma worked like a weapon. Women felt compelled to help, unaware of the danger they were in. At Florida State University in 1978, Ted's spree took a shocking turn. Over just a few weeks, he broke into sorority houses at night, attacking multiple young women. He struck quickly and silently, using bludgeoning and strangulation as his methods. In some cases, the victims were bound, controlled, and left helpless. The media frenzy began. Parents and students panicked. Sororities installed extra locks, alarms, and watch programs. Authorities warned young women not to walk alone or open their doors. But Ted's confidence only grew. He believed he could continue undetected. And for a time he could. But the law was closing in. Ted Bundy was first arrested in Utah in 1975 for suspicion of kidnapping. He represented himself in court and used his charm and intelligence to escape conviction. He was released on bail multiple times, all the while continuing his crimes. By the time he reached Florida, his criminal skill had been refined to a terrifying degree. He could escape detection, manipulate the system, and continue hunting. In 1978, Ted's luck finally began to run out. After a series of attacks in Florida, Police began linking the incidents together. On August 16, 1975, though chronologically the Florida crimes were later, Bundy's series of arrests, escapes, and eventual capture in Florida would become legendary in the annals of criminal history. Ted was arrested by the Florida Highway Patrol for suspicious behavior and minor traffic violations. Little did the officers know they had just captured one of America's most notorious predators. Ted's capture sent shockwaves through the nation. The man who had seemed charming, normal, and intelligent was finally revealed for what he truly was, a remorseless killer responsible for dozens of deaths. Even after his arrest, Ted's manipulative abilities were astonishing. He charmed court officials, jurors, and even the media. He convinced people that he could be trusted. He represented himself in court, cross-examined witnesses, and conducted his own defense. But the evidence was overwhelming. Florida police and FBI investigators meticulously documented his crimes, linking him to the brutal attacks in multiple states. Victims' families came forward, witnesses remembered encounters, and forensic evidence began painting a terrifying picture. The psychological profile was clear. Ted Bundy was a methodical, highly intelligent, and remorseless killer. He killed not out of rage, but for control, power, and obsession. Every murder was carefully planned, executed, and concealed. By 1979, Bundy was tried for the murders of several Florida women, including attacks at the Chi Omega sorority house in Tallahassee. The trial was sensationalized in the media. Ted's charisma and courtroom theatrics fascinated the public, but the horrifying nature of his crimes could not be hidden. During the trial, Bundy continued to manipulate the system. He escaped twice from custody, once from a courthouse and later from a jail, but was recaptured each time. These escapes only added to the legend of the cunning and dangerous man he had become. Ted Bundy's Florida spree and capture highlighted a terrifying reality. Intelligence, charm, and appearance can conceal evil. He exploited trust, broke every boundary, and challenged law enforcement across state lines. By the time he was finally held securely, the nation realized the magnitude of his crimes. Ted Bundy was not just a murderer. He was a calculated predator, the embodiment of manipulation, patience, and cold-blooded evil. After his final capture in Florida, Ted Bundy was placed on death row, facing the full weight of the law. The man who had once charmed friends, neighbors, and even authorities was now confined behind bars, stripped of freedom, and surrounded by the reality of his actions. But even in prison, Bundy remained unerringly calm. His intelligence and manipulative skill did not vanish. He continued to study law, practice charm, and observe people, even behind bars. To some, he remained oddly fascinating, a man who could sit quietly, answer questions politely, and still exude confidence, while knowing that the world outside feared him. Prison was a world of isolation, yet it offered Ted something he could not resist: control. He carefully selected who to speak to, who to manipulate, and how to reveal himself. Over time, psychologists, investigators, and journalists began to gain insight into his mind, though the full depth of his darkness remained hidden. Ted eventually began to confess to some of his crimes. His confessions were chilling, precise, and methodical. He did not act out of remorse at first. He spoke matter-of-factly, describing the abductions, attacks, and murders in cold detail. It was as if he were explaining a complex puzzle rather than the destruction of human lives. Through his confessions, investigators learned the full scale of his crimes, over 30 confirmed murders spanning multiple states. But Bundy hinted at even more victims, women whose disappearances were never solved. He revealed his methods, how he lured women with charm, feigned injury, or pretended to need help. He detailed his patterns of stalking, isolation, and murder. Each confession painted a picture of a man who meticulously studied human behavior. He was not a frenzied killer. He was calculating, patient, and deliberate. Every movement, every approach, every attack was carefully planned and executed with precision. Psychologists who interviewed Ted tried to understand him. How could someone so seemingly normal, so intelligent, and so charming commit such horrors? They studied his background, the childhood lies, the family deception, the isolation, the trauma. They noted his intelligence, his ability to manipulate, and his lack of empathy. Ted Bundy became a case study in evil disguised as normalcy. He demonstrated how charm and appearance could conceal the darkest impulses. He showed that intelligence and social skills could be used to manipulate, deceive, and destroy lives. In the years on death row, Bundy continued to manipulate his public image. He granted interviews, giving glimpses into his personality that fascinated the nation. He portrayed himself as intelligent, reflective, even sympathetic at times. But the truth was chilling. Behind the polite smile and articulate speech lay a mind capable of methodical, remorseless murder. Psychologists described him as a sociopath. He felt no genuine remorse, no empathy for his victims. He studied them, but never truly connected with them. Every interaction, every encounter was a means to an end. For Bundy, murder was not a crime of passion. It was a calculated exercise of power and control. By the late 1980s, Bundy's appeals had run out. The law had finally cornered him. He had exhausted every legal maneuver, every escape plan, every attempt at manipulation. The mask could no longer protect him. The nation watched as a man who had once seemed untouchable was finally facing the consequences of his actions. Ted Bundy was executed in the electric chair on January 24, 1989. He died as he had lived in many ways, composed, calm, and entirely in control of how he faced the end. Yet, even in death, Bundy's story continues to fascinate. His case offers a horrifying insight into the mind of a charming predator. He is a reminder that evil can hide behind the most ordinary face, that intelligence and charisma can mask the darkest intentions, and that appearances can deceive even the most cautious observer. Ted Bundy's legacy is both terrifying and instructive. A man who exploited trust, manipulated perception, and committed unimaginable crimes, leaving a mark on American criminal history that will never be forgotten. Ted Bundy's story did not end with his execution in 1989. In fact, his legacy continues to haunt psychologists, criminologists, and the public. Understanding Bundy's mind became one of the most important and chilling lessons in criminal psychology. How could a man so intelligent, so charming, so seemingly normal commit such heinous acts? Bundy was the ultimate manipulator. His ability to charm and deceive was his most dangerous weapon. He studied people carefully, learning what they feared, what they trusted, and how they reacted. He understood the human desire to help others and exploited it with precision. A young woman walking alone? Ted knew instinctively how to appear safe, friendly, and trustworthy. This was not impulsive behavior. Bundy was methodical, patient, calculating. Each step of his crimes was planned with care. He kept track of his victims, observed their routines, and rehearsed his approach. Every abduction, every attack was an exercise in control. Psychologists described Ted Bundy as a psychopath and a sociopath. He had no true empathy for his victims, no remorse, no guilt. He could speak about his crimes with the same detachment a scientist might use to describe an experiment. And yet he could smile, joke, and charm others outside of his crimes. This duality, normal on the outside, monstrous inside, is what made him so dangerous. He taught the world a terrifying lesson. The most dangerous predators can look ordinary, friendly, and trustworthy. Evil can hide in plain sight. Bundy's manipulative abilities extended to the legal system. He represented himself in court, cross-examined witnesses, and even charmed jurors. His intelligence allowed him to exploit procedural loopholes. In many ways, he treated his trials like puzzles, using his charm and knowledge to gain advantages wherever possible. This manipulation continued even after conviction. He granted interviews to journalists, carefully controlling how he was perceived. At times, he expressed what seemed like remorse, but experts quickly identified this as calculated, a way to maintain control over his narrative. He was always in charge of the situation, always calculating, always performing. Bundy's psychological profile became a cornerstone for law enforcement. FBI profilers studied him extensively, learning how a highly intelligent and socially adept serial killer operates. His patterns of luring victims, crossing state lines, and evading capture informed modern profiling techniques and criminal investigations. One chilling insight from Bundy's behavior is his use of trust as a weapon. Most killers rely on violence or intimidation alone, but Bundy weaponized charm, politeness, and appearance. He turned human kindness into a trap. Every time a woman opened a door to help him, she unknowingly stepped into danger. Another aspect of his psychology was obsession. Bundy was not satisfied with a single crime, he needed repetition. Each successful abduction reinforced his sense of power. Each escape from suspicion emboldened him further. His crimes were compulsive in nature, yet meticulously executed. The combination of obsession and calculation made him unique and terrifying. Bundy also demonstrated a profound understanding of human behavior. He could read social cues, manipulate emotions, and exploit vulnerabilities. He understood fear and control in a way few humans do. And he applied this knowledge not just to his victims, but to law enforcement, jurors, journalists, and even his friends. Even today, criminologists and psychologists study Bundy to understand the mind of a manipulative predator. He remains a benchmark in the study of serial killers. His case illustrates the dangers of charm, intelligence, and sociopathy combined. It is a reminder that evil is not always obvious and that appearances can be dangerously deceptive. Ted Bundy's psychology reveals the complexity of human evil. He was not simply a brute or a monster. He was a calculated, intelligent, and remorseless predator who used every tool at his disposal to hunt, control, and kill. His story teaches law enforcement, psychologists, and the public that predators may hide behind a smile, a polite greeting, or an ordinary face. Ted Bundy's story is often told through his crimes, his escapes, and his manipulations, but behind every headline, every trial, every chilling detail, there were the victims. Young women whose lives were stolen, families shattered, and communities left in fear. To truly understand Bundy, we must remember the human cost. Bundy targeted women who were often young, independent, and full of life. College students, sorority sisters, young professionals, women who trusted the world and whose kindness made them vulnerable. He studied their routines, their habits, the way they moved through the world, and he used that knowledge to lure them into danger. The first victims, like Linda and Healy, disappeared from their apartments, leaving no trace behind. Families were left bewildered, unsure where their daughters had gone. Their pain was compounded by fear and uncertainty, a terror that grew as more women vanished. Then came the attacks at sororities like Chi Omega at Florida State University. Women were bound, assaulted, and murdered in their own homes, spaces that were supposed to be safe. These attacks shocked the nation. Parents, students, and law enforcement alike struggled to comprehend how someone could commit such horrors while appearing perfectly normal to the world outside. Each victim had a story before Bundy, dreams, ambitions, friends, and families who loved them. They were walking, living, and existing in a world they trusted. Bundy's methodical stalking and careful manipulation robbed them of that world, leaving grief and fear in its wake. Families of the victims often reported noticing nothing unusual before the disappearances. Bundy's charm and ability to blend in created a terrifying invisibility. He could approach, manipulate, and abduct without suspicion. The women who trusted him, helped him, opened doors to him, had no reason to suspect danger, and that made the betrayal all the more tragic. Some victims were attacked outdoors, others in dormitories or private apartments. His methods varied, but the pattern remained. He isolated, he controlled, and he executed with precision. He targeted women he believed could be subdued easily, and he struck quickly, leaving little chance for escape. Despite the horror, the victims' courage remains part of their legacy. Some struggled, fought back, or attempted escape, demonstrating incredible bravery even in the face of unimaginable terror. Their stories, while often tragic, remind us that they were more than statistics. They were living, breathing individuals whose lives mattered deeply. Investigators later pieced together the connections between crimes, but it was only after Ted Bundy's confessions that the full scale of his spree became clear. More than 30 confirmed murders, spanning multiple states, with dozens of additional disappearances suspected to be linked to him. Every life taken left ripples of grief and trauma, not just for families, but for entire communities. Psychologists and criminologists note that Bundy's choice of victims was not random. He studied women carefully, how they walked, how they reacted, how they could be manipulated. For Bundy, his victims were objects of control. He saw them as tools to satisfy his obsession with power and domination. Yet, remembering the victims is vital. Linda and Healy, Brenda Ball, Georgianne Hawkins, Karen Sparks, Kimberly Leach. Each name represents a life taken too soon, a family shattered, and a future stolen. Their dreams, their laughter, their voices, all silenced by a man who wielded charm as a weapon. The human cost of Ted Bundy's crimes is impossible to measure. It extends beyond the individual victims to families, friends, communities, and the culture of fear he created. Each disappearance and murder forced people to question trust, to question safety, and to fear the ordinary man who might hide extraordinary evil. Bundy's victims are more than history. They are a reminder that behind every statistic is a person, a story interrupted, a life stolen, a legacy erased. By the time Ted Bundy was on trial in Florida in the late 1970s, the nation was captivated. His crimes had crossed multiple states, and the full scope of his killing spree was becoming apparent. The trial was more than a legal proceeding. It was a media spectacle, a confrontation between a charming, articulate man and the unimaginable horror of his actions. Bundy's trial was extraordinary for many reasons. First, he represented himself, insisting that he knew the law better than anyone else. The courtroom became a stage for his intellect and charisma. He cross-examined witnesses, challenged evidence, and argued with the precision of a seasoned attorney. To the public, he was mesmerizing, polite, witty, and composed. Yet behind the charm lay a man facing the consequences of his carefully concealed evil. Every word he spoke, every gesture he made was calculated. Bundy understood the power of perception. He knew that his appearance could sway opinion, that a smile could mask the darkest impulses, that eloquence could manipulate the court and the public alike. The media coverage was intense. Newspapers, television, and radio followed every detail. Bundy became both a household name and a symbol of fear. Journalists described him as handsome and intelligent, Yet the juxtaposition with his crimes created a chilling fascination. People could not understand how someone so ordinary could commit such extraordinary horrors. During the trial, evidence was overwhelming. Witnesses testified about the disappearances, survivors recounted their terrifying encounters, and physical evidence linked Bundy to multiple murders. Yet he remained composed, often charming the very people who were recounting the horror of his actions. It was a disturbing display of his manipulative genius. Bundy's courtroom antics included dramatic escapes from custody before the trial, which only added to the sense of myth surrounding him. The nation watched as a man who had terrorized women across the country manipulated the system, evading capture and asserting control even from behind bars. Despite his charm and intelligence, the verdict was clear. Bundy was found guilty of multiple murders. He received the death penalty, and the legal system finally held him accountable. Yet, even in defeat, his manipulative nature did not vanish. He continued to grant interviews, give statements, and offer confessions, controlling the narrative and maintaining the attention of the public. Bundy's trial forced society to confront uncomfortable truths. Evil can hide behind the most ordinary face. Intelligence, charm, and social skills do not guarantee morality. Trust can be weaponized, and even the most calculated predator can manipulate perception in ways that challenge the justice system. His case changed law enforcement. FBI profilers and local police adapted investigative techniques, learning to identify patterns in behavior, modus operandi, and victim selection. Bundy became a cautionary tale in criminology, a reminder that appearances can deceive and that predators may strike when least expected. Yet, while the trial focused on Bundy, it also highlighted his victims. Their stories, courage, and resilience became central to understanding the human impact of his crimes. Survivors recounted their experiences, families spoke out, and communities rallied to honor the lives lost. The trial was not just about Bundy, it was about acknowledging the humanity of the women he victimized. In the courtroom, Bundy's duality was stark. To some, he appeared almost tragic, a figure of fascination. To others, he was terrifying, the embodiment of deceit and predation. This dichotomy, a killer who was both charming and monstrous, ensured that the case would capture public attention for decades. The trial concluded with Bundy facing execution by electric chair, a sentence that would mark the final chapter in the legal battle against him. But the fascination with his psychology, his manipulation, and the scale of his crimes persisted. The nation had glimpsed evil in its most calculating human form, a man whose charisma masked monstrous intent. January 24th, 1989. Ted Bundy, one of the most notorious serial killers in American history, faced the end of his life. After years of manipulation, escapes, and trials, the man who had terrified a nation was finally in the electric chair. But even in his final hours, Bundy remained composed, calm, and unerringly controlled, a chilling reminder of the man he had been. Bundy had spent his last years on death row in Florida State Prison, reflecting on his life, speaking with investigators, journalists, and psychologists. Some of his conversations were chillingly candid, offering insight into his mind. He confessed to murders he had never admitted to before, explaining how he stalked, lured, and killed his victims with methodical precision. Despite these admissions, there was no true remorse. His tone was detached, almost clinical, describing horrific acts as if recounting a story rather than taking responsibility for lives he had destroyed. It was the same calculated mindset that had allowed him to evade capture for years: intelligence, charm, and a complete absence of empathy. In the days leading up to his execution, Bundy maintained his routine. He ate meals normally, interacted politely with prison staff, and even conversed with guards and journalists. The calmness, the composure, was unnerving to those around him. This was a man who had killed dozens of women, yet he could sit quietly, smile, and engage in ordinary conversation. The public watched closely. Media outlets broadcast the events surrounding his execution. People were fascinated, horrified, and disturbed in equal measure. Bundy had become a symbol, not just of evil, but of the terrifying reality that a predator could exist behind a charming, ordinary exterior. On the morning of January 24th, 1989, Bundy was led to the electric chair at Florida State Prison. His final moments were meticulously recorded, observed by witnesses, and recounted by those present. Bundy remained calm, offering no dramatic protests or outbursts. There is no fear, no panic, no final plea. At 7:16 a.m., the current was applied, and Ted Bundy, the man who had terrorized the American Northwest and Florida, was pronounced dead. The nightmare he had wrought on so many lives had ended, but the legacy of his crimes and the lessons they imparted would continue indefinitely. Ted Bundy's death did not erase the horror of his actions. The lives he took, the families he destroyed, and the communities he terrorized remain a chilling testament to the depths of human depravity. Yet his case also became a cornerstone for modern criminology, law enforcement, and psychological profiling. His meticulous planning, manipulation, and use of charm to gain trust became case studies for understanding psychopathy and sociopathy. Law enforcement learned from Bundy's methods, refining techniques for tracking and apprehending serial killers. His crimes revealed patterns that helped investigators recognize and prevent future acts of violence. But beyond the lessons for professionals, Bundy's story serves as a stark reminder to society. Trust, appearance, and charm are not always what they seem. Evil can be calculated, deliberate, and hidden behind the most ordinary face. And sometimes the most dangerous individuals are not immediately recognizable. Bundy's legacy also lies in remembering the victims. Each life taken, Linda and Healy, Brenda Ball, Georgianne Hawkins, Kimberly Leach, and so many others, represents a tragedy that should never be forgotten. Their stories, courage, and the grief of their families underscore the human cost behind the headlines. In the years since his execution, Ted Bundy has remained a subject of fascination and study. Books, documentaries, and psychological profiles continue to examine his life, his crimes, and his mind. People are drawn to understand how a man so intelligent and seemingly normal could commit such horrors. Yet, the fascination comes with a sobering truth. Bundy was not fictional. He was real. He was human. And the lives he destroyed were irreplaceable. Ted Bundy's story, spanning childhood deception, charm, obsession, and murder, concludes with his execution. But the lessons endure. Vigilance, awareness, and the recognition that appearances can deceive are crucial in understanding human behavior. The man who terrorized a nation is gone, but the impact of his crimes on victims, families, law enforcement, and society will never fade. The end of the Ted Bundy series, from his early childhood trauma to his chilling death row confessions, the story of Ted Bundy is a journey into the darkest corners of a human mind, reminder of how intelligence and charm can mask unimaginable evil, and how the human cost of such crimes is profound and lasting.